All right, we're diving into a conflict that absolutely shaped the modern world. But for a lot of us in the West, it's barely a footnote in the history books. This is the story of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal, sprawling conflict that you could argue was the real start of World War II. Let's get right into it. So let me just ask you a question. Where did World War II really begin? I mean, think about it. For most of us, an answer just pops into our heads almost instantly, a specific date, a very specific place. And that answer is almost always Poland, 1939. But here's the thing, that's not the whole story. Not even close. What if I told you the world's deadliest conflict actually kicked off 2 years earlier and half a world away? Because the first shots of that global firestorm weren't fired in Europe. They were fired in China, way back in 1937.
To really get how we ended up there, you have to rewind a little and look at the two main players. See, in the early 20th century, Japan and China were on completely opposite paths, and they were heading for a massive collision.
I mean, just look at this contrast. On one side, you've got Japan's Meiji Miracle. It's incredible. They basically went from a feudal society of samurai to a full-blown industrial powerhouse in just a few decades. They even defeated Russia, a major European power, back in 1905. Then you have China, deep in what they call their century of humiliation. The last dynasty was crumbling, foreign powers were carving it up, and the whole country just collapsed into chaos, run by brutal regional warlords. And as the new century rolled on, things only got more intense. Japan felt like it got a raw deal from the West after World War I, and then the Great Depression hit, which just poured fuel on the fire of its rising militarism. Meanwhile, in China, a powerful new sense of nationalism was bubbling up, and out of that came two major rivals, the ruling nationalists, or KMT, and Mao's growing communist movement, the CCP. Both wanted to unify China, but man, they had very different ideas on how to do it. So all this simmering tension, it first boiled over in China's northeast. Japan looked at China's rich resources and its internal chaos and saw a golden opportunity. This was the prelude to total war. You know, this war didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a really slow burn. It all started back in 1931 with the Mukden incident. Japanese officers literally faked an attack on their own railway just to have an excuse to invade and occupy Manchuria. But the really wild part for China came in 1936. Their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was so focused on wiping out the communists that his own generals kidnapped him. It's called the Xi'an Incident, and it basically forced him to stop, face reality, and form a very shaky truce to deal with the real enemy at the gates, Japan. And if you want to get inside Chiang Kai-shek's head, this quote tells you everything you need to know. He truly believed the communists were a disease of the heart, something internal and deadly, while the Japanese were just a disease of the skin, an external annoyance. He was prioritizing a civil war over a foreign invasion, a huge gamble that almost destroyed China before the main event even started. And that right there brings us to 1937, the year that long, slow burn finally erupts into a full-blown inferno. The spark was a pretty minor, confusing skirmish between some troops near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. Honestly, it could have been nothing. But unlike the invasion of Manchuria 6 years earlier, this time was different. China drew a line in the sand. They were done retreating. And so, this small incident spiraled into a massive, undeclared war. And that led to the Battle of Shanghai. For 3 absolutely brutal months, the world watched as Chinese soldiers held their ground in what can only be described as an urban meat grinder. They proved they would fight for every single inch of their country. Now, Shanghai did eventually fall to Japan's superior air power and tech, but a message had been sent, loud and clear. China was not going to go down easy. But what came next is one of the darkest chapters of the entire 20th century. After capturing China's capital, Nanjing, Japanese forces unleashed 6 weeks of systematic, unspeakable violence on the city's civilians. This event, now known as the Rape of Nanjing, was an atrocity that horrified the world. For China, it completely galvanized resistance. Any hope for peace was gone. From that moment on, it was a fight to the death. For years, the rest of the world kind of looked at this as a regional problem, but Japan's ambition, and the fact that they were getting stuck in a quagmire in China, was about to drag everyone into the fight.
So how exactly did this happen? How does a war in China lead to Pearl Harbor? Well, it was like a series of dominoes that Japan itself set up.
First, they were totally bogged down in China, a country just too vast to conquer. Second, their war machine was running on fumes thanks to a US oil embargo. That meant they desperately needed resources from Southeast Asia. And to pull that off, they made one last gigantic gamble, a surprise attack to knock the US Pacific Fleet out of the picture at Pearl Harbor. And boom, just like that, on December 7th, 1941, the war in China violently merged into the wider conflict we call World War II. China was no longer alone. Allied aid, including the legendary Flying Tigers, started flowing in, helping to keep China in the fight against Japan. So when Japan finally surrendered in 1945, China was on the winning side, right? Well, yes, but that victory came at a price that is almost impossible to imagine, and it set the stage for a dramatic and violent second act. I mean, just try to wrap your head around the cost. Up to 20 million Chinese people dead, military and civilian, an entire generation just gone. The country's economy was completely decimated. It's what historians call a Pyrrhic victory, a win so devastatingly costly it feels more like a loss. And the moment the foreign invaders were gone, that shaky truce between the nationalists and communists, it just shattered. The Chinese Civil War was back on, immediately. And after 4 more years of brutal fighting, the totally exhausted nationalist forces fled to Taiwan. And in 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. And this right here is why a war that ended decades ago still matters so much today. These aren't just old scars. For many, they're still open wounds. The political fallout, the historical memory, all the unresolved tensions from this war continue to define the incredibly complex relationship between China, Japan, Taiwan, and yeah, by extension, the entire world. You know, if there's one image that really sums up this whole brutal conflict, it's this one. Japan came in with all the force of a modern industrial hammer. They expected to just shatter a weak, divided nation. But China, despite all the suffering, proved to be an anvil, one that absorbed every single blow, endured, and in the end, refused to break. So I'll just leave you with this thought. The next time you hear about tensions in East Asia, remember this history. Remember this forgotten war that is still, quietly, shaping the geopolitics, the alliances, and the world that you and I live in today.